The book has a number of chapters, and I've decided that it would be boring if I just tried to review all these chapters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction and then focus on one particular chapter or issue that is in that book that to me is perhaps one of the most interesting. When we chose the title, Dawn Burgess was an ex-graduate student of mine, and she did a PhD in geophysics, but she also likes writing. So after she got her PhD, she switched to writing, and that's saved me because I could have not written this book. It's not a technical book. It's popular, and there's no way I could have done that. I can barely write technical papers, and so anyway, there's a big, turns out, just by way of introduction, there's a pretty big issue there about catastrophic events. Arnold Toynbee, in 1939, with his very strong, opinionated voice, said the causes of the breakdown of civilizations are not the acts of God. Well, okay. Neither are they the vain repetitions of senseless laws of nature. And the reason is that for historians, the senseless laws of nature make it kind of boring to deal with historical conflicts, wars, etc. Will Durant is an American archaeologist, historian, sorry, who has a completely opposite point of view. He's stated at one of his books, he says, civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. So we have two really opposing views from two different historians. One is British, the other one is American. Maybe that has something to do with it, I'm not sure. So what is it about earthquakes and archaeology? Basically, the study of archaeology, in my simple-minded view, is the study of ruins. Archaeologists to work in the field, not theoretical types, excavating archaeology. It's a study of ruins. And when you look at the totality of these studies and what's been published and found and so on, and you think of what caused so many ruins, especially in the Mediterranean basin of Central America, as earth scientists, you cannot escape the pretty obvious conclusion that at least some of these ruins, maybe many of them, were caused by earthquakes. So that issue, the possible link between earthquakes and archaeology, raises it turns out, some really important questions for geophysics. It raises important questions for archaeology. And it also raised a debate between geophysics and archaeology, or geophysicists and archaeologists, between me and some archaeologists who really don't like this stuff too much. So what are significant geophysics questions that can benefit from archaeological evidence? For example, in earthquake studies, we have a real problem in knowing what is the time space pre-instrumental, that means pre-20th century, pre-instrumental pattern of large earthquakes. We don't know. We don't have records. We don't have, there's some written record, but those records become very poor when you go back a few hundred years and they're sparse. So we don't really know what time space pre-instrumental patterns of large earthquakes are, and that means that all our efforts to predict earthquakes, large earthquakes, are really hampered by a lack of a data set to compare. How big can an earthquake be? For example, how big can an earthquake in the Bay Area be? We know the 1906 earthquake was a magnitude 8.8 or something like that, maybe 8.4. Can it be much bigger? The San Andreas fault is much bigger than the part that ruptured in 1906. How big can it be, and how frequent would that be, or infrequent? And then I'll show you an example. I'll show you a case. Do these large faults, do they always, can they operate as a bunch of smaller earthquakes, or once in a while can there be one huge earthquake that destroys half of the Earth? These are sort of questions that earthquake scientists should worry about, but we haven't because we don't have any data source. And Stanford is a good place to think about it. This is Stanford 1906. And I like to show it because it's Geology Corner. That's where earthquake prediction was. So 1906, they fixed it, and then similar distortion, although less than that, happened again in the Loma Prieta earthquake in 89. The same keystones dropped and so on. So here are some significant archaeological questions. Why are there so many ruins in Central America and the Mediterranean and Turkey and Iran and so on? Because all the archaeology is basically in ruins. Why are there so many levels or layers of destruction in some of, I list here some of the most famous sites on Earth. Knossos has 10 levels of destruction and therefore rebuilding. So it was destroyed and rebuilt 10 times in its history. Why is that? Jericho has something like around 22 layers. Armageddon, which is in northern Israel, which Hebrew is called Megiddo, has over 30 levels of destruction. And Troy, the most famous maybe of them all, has almost over 40 levels of destruction and rebuilding, destruction and rebuilding. We know only of about one Trojan War, but this place was destroyed over 40 times. Another question that's very interesting to archaeology, I won't have time to talk about it, is who buried the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were found in caves in the Judean desert, and it appears that most of the stuff was buried when caves collapsed in an earthquake or a couple of earthquakes. The roofs just came down. And then there's an issue in archaeology and history, is the nature of regional destructions and system collapse. Earthquakes, as I'll show you, have traditionally been rejected as an important agent. This is just a picture of Troy. I don't know, it's the wrong place. Yeah. So what I'll do here, I'll take one chapter out of my book, or one thing that we worked on that to me is one of the most intriguing, and that has to do with the archaeological and historical question that is of tremendous interest, and that is the catastrophic end of the Bronze Age. Now, around 1200 BC, there was a major collapse of the late Bronze Age. In fact, the end of the Bronze Age is defined by the collapse that happened sometime around 1200 BC. This is the political situation in the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey around 1200 BC. These were the different powers that were in place at the time. And what happened is that around 1200 BC, many of them, I would say most of them, simply collapsed. The collapse was political, the collapse was cultural, and the collapse was physical. The centers were physically destroyed. And according to Bob Drews, for example, a historian at Princeton at the time, or I think he was at Princeton, he says this is probably, given world population at the time, that was probably the largest collapse in human history, where not just one empire or one powerful nation collapsed, but the entire region. This is a map that shows sites, archaeological sites, that were excavated by a whole number of archaeologists over different periods of time. The numbers here indicate the sites that have basically physically collapsed based on archaeology between, say, 1225 BC to 1175 BC, over a 50-year period or so. And the list of these sites is at least 50 or almost 50, and some of them are extremely famous, like Mycenae, Knossos, Troy, many more. And entire island of Cyprus was destroyed. Ugarit in Syria, I'll come back to it in a minute. And then in the southern Levant, it's Megiddo, Armageddon. And in fact, in my opinion, Jericho needs to be added here too. So something really catastrophic happened over a really short period of time. And it remained a big puzzle of what happened, what caused that. One of the most widely accepted theories, I wouldn't really call it theory in retrospect, but ideas, attribute the collapse around 1200 BC, which defines the end of the Bronze Age, to the onslaught of the so-called Sea People, displaced populations from Anatolia who moved southward, destroying cities in Cyprus, Syria, and Palestine. In fact, the Sea People concept is even broader. This is one depiction, sort of a guess, of what these Sea People migration path were. They came from what's today Albania, and they attacked the Peloponnesus and Crete and Troy and so on, while the another migration attacked the Hittite Empire, and then the people that were kicked out of Knossos attacked Cyprus, and the Cypriots attacked Syria. Sort of a huge domino theory of huge migrations. That was the Sea People idea. The controversy is this: there's no really independent evidence that these Sea People existed. And the fact that they are called Sea People is due to the difficulty that if you look at the destruction of Mycenae around 1200 BC, there's no power around Mycenae that can be identified that went in there and destroyed the place, while Agamemnon was doing the same to Troy, which is over here. So the only solution was to say these powers must have come by the sea. They had huge navies, they invaded the Peloponnesus, they destroyed many sites in the Peloponnesus, wiped it out, took the women, took the grain, took the gold, and disappeared. But as Morcott, who is a historian archaeologist in the UK, despite having been favored until quite recently, this idea of a Sea People migration can no longer be accepted. There is no real evidence to support it. Essentially, the Sea People's theory was a convenient and plausible invention of the 19th century, designed largely by the historian Gaston Maspero to fit the very limited available facts of widespread destruction. And if you assume that destruction is by armies, then you have to figure out where did those armies come from, and since they weren't locally available, they must have come by the sea. Well, this, the questioning of the Sea People started actually in 1948. This is a map that I copied out of a book by Claude Chafer, who was an extremely prominent French archaeologist. Actually, he was the president of the French National Academy of Sciences, a very respected scientist. He excavated the city of Ugarit, which is here and on the Syrian coast today, which was one of the big commerce centers of the Eastern Mediterranean time, a huge port and so on. And he concluded that Ugarit was simply wiped out of history, destroyed by a large earthquake, just from looking at the evidence of collapsed walls, destruction. The library of Ugarit was buried under rubble and so on. And he concluded that this could not have been an attack, it must have been an earthquake. And it's conceivable that he experienced a little earthquake while he was excavating and connected the two. Well, that wasn't a big issue, but then in this map, he says, well, you know what? Maybe because Ugarit was was one of the sites that were wiped out at the end of the Bronze Age. He says, maybe all the sites that were destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age were by an earthquake. And that got him into incredible trouble. And I'll just show you an example here. Elizabeth French, who excavated Mycenae for many years. She inherited the site from her father, who was also excavating Mycenae. In a meeting that we had in Greece in 1993, she responded to this idea that Schaffer proposed. He says, archaeologists of my generation who attended university in the immediate aftermath of Schaffer's great work in 1948 were brought up to view earthquakes, like religion, as an explanation of archaeological phenomena to be avoided if at all possible. So this was in 1993. So that means that Schaffer not only did not convince his colleagues, but they thought him kind of a nut. Now, part of it has to do with the fact that when he suggested this in 1948, our idea of plate tectonics didn't exist. In fact, we barely understood the geography of large earthquakes. It's only since 1948, actually since 1965 or so, that we began to understand plate tectonics, and which meant that there are plate boundaries, which are the sites of most of the large earthquakes, and the plates move, and these large faults have repeated earthquakes on them because the plates keep on moving, and they've been moving like that for millions of years. Schaffer didn't have that. So at the time, they thought, well, he's just invoking something out of thin air. And actually, so in 1980 or so, I had the idea, because I was interested in earthquake prediction, and I thought it would be nice to look at the past. I had the idea of revisiting Schaffer's idea. I liked the possible connection with earthquakes and destruction, and archaeological destruction. I realized that he did not know anything about plate tectonics at the time, so the time was right to go back, and that's basically what I did here. Now, in this map of the plate boundaries and the different plates and how they move, I also put some of the most famous sites in red dots. This is Troy, this is Mycenae, this is Knossos, this is Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. This is Armageddon, this is Jericho, and so on. So we'll visit some of these in a bit. So the first step was to take a map of instrumental recorded Eastern Mediterranean earthquakes of magnitude 6.5 and larger in the 20th century or so. So this is really data. And here is a North Anatolian fault, and here's an East Anatolian fault, and this is a Dead Sea fault, which are prominent plate boundaries. A little bit like this would be like the equivalent to the San Andreas here. The North Anatolian fault has very large earthquakes all the time on it. What we know how to do today, we can take the seismicity map and compute probabilities over a fixed period of time of intensity of ground motion, which is the thing that would be relevant to figuring out where you had more horizontal ground motion, where less, and if you have structures there, they're more vulnerable to earthquakes. So in dark brown, is the region that you would say over a given period of time has experienced high intensity ground motion. And here I removed the epicenter, so you have a map of a kind of seismic risk. And this map is more or less relevant to the ground in this region for certainly 1 million, 2 million years past. Now I did something kind of tricky, and I took Robert Drew's map of the sites that define, the destroyed sites that define the end of the Bronze Age, and I superimposed it on this, what we know from seismicity, seismic risk, or seismic ground motion, from data in the 20th century. And there's a very, not surprising actually, correlation between those 48 sites that he listed and the regions that are that experience or have experienced large earthquakes in the past. I'll just show you a few examples. This is Mycenae. This is the famous, some of you, who has been to Mycenae? Yeah. This is the Line Gate, and this is the entrance to it. And of course, when you walk in here, it's so spectacular. You stop and you look at it and so on. Most visitors don't watch this here, which is a fault plane. And here's a picture taken from some distance. This is a Stanford field trip we took there. This is a fault scarp, and it's so polished that you know that it's been scraped by slippage fairly recently, maybe in the last few hundred years. And they actually used this scarp as part of a defensive cyclopean wall that defended Mycenae. This is the wall right here, and it goes all around the site. So for geologists or geophysicists that come here, that's the thing we look at. And I don't have a picture here, but this cyclopean wall, if you go around the Mycenaean site, you see it's all patched up, and it was repaired many times over, which would be consistent with the idea that this is actually an active fault. The thing is sitting on an active fault. And for the geologist among you, it turns out Mycenae is just a push-up hill caught between two strike-slip faults, and it pushed it up, like we have many of those in California. This is a fault that when you stand on top of Mycenae, it's a poor picture, but this is a fault. It's a normal fault here that runs right into the site of Mycenae. And there was a magnitude 6 point something earthquake here in 1950 or so. Now, there's other evidence in archaeology that is also, we found, extremely telling. And I don't have time to go into many examples, but this is a skeleton of a woman crushed in the collapse of her roof about 1200 BC. And this is probably the most telling evidence for sort of earthquake-like collapse, because if it's a war or an attack, the enemy doesn't bother to crush people, then bury them under rubble. And we have found crushed skeleton in so many sites by now, and they have been reported in so many places. And it's clearly not a burial. Crushed skeletons, crushed heads, bones, and so on. It's the obvious explanation is earthquake. Here's another example from Tiryns, which is another site in the Peloponnesos. Another crushed skeleton, a woman and a child killed by fallen walls of building X. This is what the field archaeologists who excavated reported. This is not somebody who was thinking about earthquakes. They just reported that the mother and the baby were crushed when the wall collapsed on them. And that's the most obvious, the most simplest, most obvious explanation is that an earthquake happened and they got trapped. Another thing we know about earthquakes is that they follow a sort of frequency magnitude distribution. The magnitude is related to the strength of the earthquake. It's intensity of ground motion measured at the epicenter. And then on a log scale, it's a number of events. So for example, this is estimated for about 2,500 years for Greece by two Greek geophysicists or seismologists. So over 2,500 years in Greece, they're estimated that there may be one magnitude 8.3 or 8.4 earthquakes in the Greek area. However, over the same period of time, we may have we have something like 10 to the 5. 10 to the 5 is what? 100,000 magnitude 5 earthquakes over this period of time. That means every few weeks there is one. And in between you have this distribution. So really destructive earthquakes may be in this region because of heavy construction with stone masonry and no resistance to horizontal ground motion, which is the most devastating. Probably between magnitude 6 to 7.5 or so. That's the relevant range of destructive earthquakes. And so we have, over this period of time, we have several hundred of those, thousands maybe. And here's a table that shows that you can calculate a sort of mean return period, although they are not really, they don't return regularly, but on average, magnitude 5 would be, what is it, 0.05, 5% of a year, what is that, every 2 weeks. A magnitude 6 maybe every 6 months, and a magnitude 8 maybe every 1,000 years. So if you have a site that's several thousand years old in that high intensity region, there's no way that that site could have escaped repeated shaking by earthquakes, and some of the shaking was very damaging, must have been very damaging, and must have caused partial destruction or collapse or whatever. And that begins to explain why we have, in many of these sites, so many levels of destruction. I told you, Troy, for example, has over 40 levels. When they excavated Troy down to the bedrock, they recognized that it was destroyed for over 40 times, and that meant also rebuilt. So it got destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt. And it's really difficult to imagine that there were 40 Trojan Wars or the equivalent to it. But if Troy is situated in an area where there are repeated earthquakes, let's say every few hundred years you have a destructive earthquake, this becomes kind of obvious. It's destroyed, partially destroyed. If they can, they rebuild it. Now, some of these rebuilding episodes are not continuous. Troy must have occasionally, some of these levels were followed by abandonment for a few hundred years, and then rebuilding, gradual rebuilding, and then until another earthquake happened. One example to this is the destruction of the Hattusas, the capital of the Hittite Empire, which was a huge empire. It was a power that was about equal to Egypt at the time. There was a famous battle here in Kadesh between the Egyptian and the Hattusas, the Hittites in, when was that, 1400 BC or something like that. What's that? Yeah, Ramses II. And both of them claimed victory. It's a little bit like we do nowadays, too. But then in 1200 BC, this entire empire collapsed, or at least the capital and other strongholds of the Hittite just got wiped out, and the Hittite Empire was no more. Now, what I've done here is, this is the North Anatolian Fault, and I borrowed here from Ambraces and Finkel, who are, Ambraces is a civil engineer who specializes in seismic risk, and Finkel is a historian. They put together, they looked at an earthquake that happened in Turkey in 1668. It was a magnitude maybe 7.5 on the North Anatolian Fault. The epicenter was here somewhere. And they were able to tell from written records and other evidence that this was more or less the intensity 9 contour for this particular earthquake. In other words, everything that was in 1668, every settlement or every major structure in this region must have been subject to immense shaking. It doesn't mean that all of them have collapsed, but many of them must have been damaged by this earthquake. I just did a trick here. I superimposed this on, I put the Hattusas, the capital of Hittite Empire, in it. And the point is that if in 1200 BC or so, we had a similar earthquake on the North Anatolian Fault, which is quite possible, this would be close to the epicenter, and the damage here could be just immense. And when you go to Hattusas today, I've been there a few years ago, it's an incredible site. It's huge, and it was physically destroyed by something. And we don't know if any sea people or any attackers that came there. It most likely was an earthquake. Here's Troy. This is ancient Troy, extremely strategic, extremely important. And again, I put it on a map, also from Ambraces and Finkel, on the intensity map of a Sea of Marmara earthquake of 1918. The epicenter was here somewhere. It was magnitude 7.4. And you can see that Troy, if Troy was thriving in 1918, it would have been extremely badly damaged by this earthquake. Or if there was an earthquake in 1200 BC when Troy was alive and settled and operated, it would also have been extremely badly damaged by this earthquake. And in fact, the excavations of Troy, and that's a slide that was misplaced, has revealed tremendous collapse of walls, of buildings, of crushed skeletons in Troy that would be really consistent with having something like this earthquake, 1200 BC, that destroyed Troy. And before that, there were several levels, and after that, there were several more levels of Troy. But the Trojan War story probably is somehow tied to this end of the Bronze Age, 1200 BC. That was Agamemnon's time, and so on. And even in the Iliad, for whatever value you can give to the text, because this was written 400 years or so after the presumed Trojan War by Homer, they were shaken all the foothills of Ida, which is the Troy area, which has many springs, the city of Trojan and the Achaean ships. So somehow he has a link to an earthquake here, which really is not surprising. This is the North Anatolian Fault. It's extremely active seismically, and there's no way that Troy could have escaped earthquakes in its history. Now, whether the Trojan War itself is exactly an earthquake story or not, we cannot prove it, at least at present, but it makes much more sense than actually the Trojan War story itself, when you think about it. It's a bizarre story with a wooden horse and all that. And certainly is much more interesting than sea people attacking, some coming from nowhere, attacking and then disappearing. Well, this destruction wasn't all at once. The end of the Bronze Age was spread out over something like a 50-year period. Why is that? Well, here is a clue. This is 20th century, the North Anatolian Fault, starting in 1939 here, and then moving west. There was a sequence of very large earthquake. This was a magnitude 7.8 or so, 8 in 1939. It ruptured something like 300 kilometers of the fault system. So it's comparable to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, maybe bigger. Then 3 years later, there was another earthquake in 42, which was a magnitude 7, and 1943, another one like this, and then 1944, 1951, 1957, 1967. So for a good part of the 20th century, a storm of earthquakes hit the North Anatolian Fault, propagating in this case from east to west. And we know from the amount of displacement offset on these associated with these faults, this could not be a steady state pattern. We know how fast the plates move here. This plate is moving to the right. This plate is moving to the west. To make up, say, 5 meters of displacement, the plates have to move for several hundred years before enough strain is accumulated to release it again. So we know from the North Atlantic Fault, these are episodic. They are periods of high seismic activity, short periods, and long periods of relative quiescence. Here is another example to this. It goes back to the 4th century. The Roman Empire was still reasonably intact, so we have a lot of written records of what happened over a period of about 20 or 30 years. All these sites that highlighted here were either damaged or destroyed by earthquakes over that very short period of time in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we know it wasn't a single earthquake because the region is too big. We know it was a sequence of earthquakes, probably started at the Dead Sea Fault in 363, and then Cyprus a few years later, and so you go around North Anatolian Fault, Crete, Peloponnesus, Sicily, and Libya. A storm of earthquakes has swept through this region over a very short period of time, sort of middle to late 4th century AD. So it appears that in this region, that's actually how earthquakes occur. They occur in clusters in time, and they sweep as a storm throughout the region, and then it's quiet for a long time, for a few hundred years, and then enough strain is accumulated, and it repeats itself. So it's not a single earthquake. It's spread over some period of time, and that's probably why it's possible that the end of the Bronze Age, therefore, smeared out over a 50-year period. Now, one thing that is well known also from archaeology, basically, is that following the catastrophic collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, Greece, for example, went into a Dark Age period that lasted for about 300 years or 400 years. Why the Dark Age period? One of the important pieces of evidence that this happened, the real change in culture, politics, everything, is the fact that the language, the written language that existed before the end of the Bronze Age was Linear B. It was something like glyphs. This is a tablet that was uncovered in Pylos that predates the 1200 BC. It's a clay tablet, and this was the written language that Pylos is Peloponnesus, that was pre-Greek language. It took tens of years to decipher this language, and one of the problems is that most of the evidence for this language has long been gone because they used to write it on clay tablets. Clay tablets deteriorate with time unless they're buried or preserved. There's no evidence left. This particular tablet in Pylos survived because it got baked in a fire that broke out in Pylos while it was destroyed. So it's even possible that it's not that far-fetched that the earthquake caused a fire as part of a destruction, and it caught some of the tablets and baked them, and so this is the evidence we see today. Now, why do I show this to you is because the end of the Bronze Age led to Dark Ages, after which a completely new Greek culture has emerged. First of all, the alphabet replaced whatever this language represented. It now got replaced by the alphabet, which came from Phoenicia and Palestine. Completely different approach to writing. Probably the language changed. And what's even more important probably is that the political system changed. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look back, you can realize that when we talk about the destruction at the end of the Bronze Age, we're really talking about the destruction of monumental buildings, which are forts, temples, and palaces, because they were massive structures, vulnerable to earthquakes. The poor farmers who lived in the fields had probably tents and so on, probably completely oblivious to these earthquakes, and it didn't impact their livelihood and so on. And in fact, as more and more archaeology is done on ancient farming communities and small villages, they find that many of these places just sailed through the end of the Bronze Age without any impact. You don't find any evidence for any catastrophic event. So it appears that it's just the massive structures. And when you think about it, these massive structures were something that the concentrated elites of these powers or these nations put together. They had to build fortifications to defend themselves from the poor farmers that were out there and paid taxes through their nose. And they had to protect the grain and the gold and the coins that they accumulated, just the ruling class. They had to build defenses to it, and they eventually became quite vulnerable. And so when an earthquake hit, these defenses collapse, and the whole thing, their power collapses. So we have, I just have here 3 examples to this. There are more, but we'll just do 3. The first example you can think of is Jericho, probably wiped out around 1300 BC. The story we have is Joshua, We don't know if it's a real story. We don't know if it's patched together from various tidbits that were kind of oral transmissions. But basically, the story is around 1300 BC, Jericho, which it's an oasis in a really parched desert, was attacked by nomadic invaders who saw that they lived really very well there. They had a wall that they had to build to defend themselves. And the idea then is that the wall collapsed by an earthquake. Jericho is just 2 kilometers away from the Dead Sea Fault, and we know there are destructive earthquakes every 300 or 400 years. So my interpretation is that this story of Joshua and the destruction of Jericho around that time is rooted in some memory of earthquakes, and the earthquakes that destroyed the defenses of the people who lived inside the city, and it enabled the invaders to take over. The second one is Sparta, and the third one is a story of Jerusalem. This is a monastery outside Jericho. I just love this picture. It was destroyed in a magnitude 6.25 earthquake in 1927 outside Jericho. And the site must have suffered similar punishment 4 or 5 times since it was first built in 200 AD. Not far from the site of baptism on the Jordan. What I love about this picture is that you really can't tell whether it's a 20th century, 15th century, or 3rd century. These people are still the same. And what's interesting about it, it's rebuilt now. It's been rebuilt every time an earthquake hit it. They've rebuilt it more or less exactly the same it was before, because they had no notion of repeated earthquakes. Here's the Joshua story. That's what just out of Old Testament. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city and they utterly destroyed all that was in it. Well, it's really difficult to, actually the trumpets were horns. It's really hard to imagine that in reality the trumpets brought down the wall. So there's probably a coincidence here of events and stories. The nomadic tribes were milling around Jericho for a long time, and one morning they realized the earthquake destroyed their defenses, and so they took over. Sparta. This is really a fascinating story. There are several historical references. Diodorus is a Greek historian at the time. The last war between them, the Spartans and the Messenians, broke out on the occasion of a great earthquake. Practically the whole of Sparta was destroyed and deprived of men, so the surviving Messenians joined with the Helots. The Helots were basically an oppressed, poor people that oppressed by Sparta, living around Sparta, who had helped them in the revolt and settled Itome after Messenia has been desolated for a long time. What happened here is that the Spartans were pretty rough rulers of their neighborhoods. They taxed the Helots and others to their nose, and they collected all the stuff inside Sparta. I don't know if you saw the movie 300. It captured something of the Spartan spirit. Well, this earthquake really destroyed all the defenses of Sparta, and I remember a Greek historian once told me, you know, because of this earthquake, the slaves of Sparta escaped. And I said, well, what's the big deal? He said, well, 85% of all the people who lived in Sparta were slaves. So it really destroyed their economy too. And it triggered a war, an uprising of the oppressed people around them. And finally, a really fascinating story about the Jerusalem earthquake that happened in 31 BC. We have a detailed description by Josephus. the Jewish historian who described the period. At this time it was that the fight happened at Actium in Greece between Octavius Caesar and Mark Antony in the 7th year of the reign of Herod, who was king in Jerusalem. And then it was also that there was an earthquake in Judea, such a one as had not happened at any other time, in which earthquake brought a great destruction upon the cattle in the country. About 10,000 men also perished by the fall of houses, but the army which lodged in the field received no damage by this sad accident. When the Arabians, actually that's Jordanians today, were informed of this, because all this happened during a war, there will always be a war there, still ongoing today. They informed of this, and when those that hated the Jews and pleased themselves with aggravating the reports told them of it, they raised their spirits as if their enemy's country was quite overthrown, and the men were utterly destroyed and thought there now remains nothing that could oppose them. They heard that the walls of the city of Jerusalem collapsed, and that means its defense was gone. And the Jewish army under Herod was actually ready to surrender to the Jordanians. But Herod had this incredible speech, according to Josephus. Maybe Josephus made it up, talking to his generals and his army. Do not disturb yourself at the quaking of inanimate creature, nor do not imagine that this earthquake is a sign of another calamity. For such affectation of the elements are according to the course of nature, nor does it import anything further to man than what mischief it does immediately of itself. Perhaps there may come some short sign beforehand in the case of pestilence and famines and earthquakes, but these calamities themselves have their force limited by themselves. And indeed, what greater mischief can the war, though it should be a violent one, do to us than the earthquake hath done? So this is an example where the destruction of a defense system by an earthquake has inflamed a war. In this case, the walls of the city of Jerusalem were not completely destroyed, and Herod, with this speech, was able to lift the spirit of his army, and they were able to prevail, actually. Well, so what I told you is just sort of a try to describe a possible way that earthquakes have interacted with history and what we see in archaeology in terms of collapse and the end of the Bronze Age, the major collapse. I should add that Greece, it's not only that the new language, the Greek language as we know it today, emerged and replaced Linear B, but also their political structure was changed. And Athens then emerged with a democratic system. It's not exactly our kind of democracy, but it means that power was now much more widespread, much less centralized. The ruling class was not that powerful anymore, probably because this centralized pre-end of Bronze Age system was not tenable anymore. They couldn't keep that centralized power going anymore. So a whole new system emerged. So the end of the Bronze Age is just an example, maybe a spectacular example, for the general issue of system collapse in history. This is a table I took out of a book by Joseph Tainter, who is a historian. The title of the book is The Collapse of Complex Societies. This is out of chapter 5. Earthquakes are not mentioned in this book, but these are, what do we have here, maybe a dozen or 15 of the greatest civilization collapses in history that we know of. And the entire book is dedicated to developing a theory, a social, economic, political theory of what leads to collapse. And it's an interesting book. I read it several times, but I don't fully get it. What I highlighted here, or put here in this bluish thing, are the collapses that probably are easiest to at least propose, that they involve the destruction or partial destruction by earthquakes. And the idea then would be that the earthquakes hit at the time when these civilizations were either vulnerable, decline, at state of war, and a big earthquake basically decimated their defense system, decimated maybe their economic basis, and led to their end. This is true not only in the Mediterranean, but also in Central America. For example, Casa Grande was a tremendous site in the Sonora Desert in Mexico that collapsed in around 1400 BC, about 100 years before the European arrived. And it turns out that in 1886 there was a huge earthquake that happened at the same place, so same story. And finally, I've been trying to look at evidence in Central America that would be similar. And this is one of my favorite examples, which I have a 20-year-old debate with the Mexican archaeologist about it. This is the city of Teotihuacan, which was, I think, the third largest city in the world at the time, around 900 AD. This is the Pyramid of the Sun and the Moon. This is the Avenue of the Dead. And somewhere here, they've excavated this. There are three sort of groups of stairs. And they couldn't explain why. These are older stairs, and somebody came in here and built new stairs on top of it, but they are offset. And then somehow there's another set of stairs here that don't quite match with this, mesh with this. They have a hard time explaining this. Well, this would be trivial if we could prove that earthquakes happened here. We know there are earthquakes in central Mexico. And my interpretation is most likely is that there was an earthquake that leveled this part of Teotihuacan. They leveled it off, built another staircase. Another earthquake happened, leveled it off, built another staircase. And somewhere I have a, yeah. So anyway, to conclude, I believe that an earthquake storm around 1200 BC could have contributed to system collapse at the, that ended the Bronze Age in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. The physical damage to defenses, monumental building, and people by this earthquake storm, like we have in the North Anatolian Fault in the 20th century, could have rendered the key late Bronze Age centers vulnerable to attack by outside invaders and by indigenous or neighboring population. And the destruction caused by an earthquake storm could have been the first link in a chain of events which led to the political, social, and economic system collapse in the Aegean Eastern Mediterranean at that time, which then, after a period of dark ages, which was needed to rebuild, led to a completely new political system, which is Athens and democracy in Greece. Now, I cheated you a little bit when I gave you the quote from Elizabeth French. She was in a conference that I met her in this conference about earthquakes and archaeology. And she actually took us to Mycenae, and she just got livid when we told her that as we walk into Mycenae, that this is actually an active fault. She says, how come I never heard about that? And, but anyway, eventually the proceedings were published, and this is really what she said in the abstract. the aftermath of Schaffer's great work, we're brought up to view earthquakes like religion as an explanation of archaeological phenomena to be avoided if at all possible. But I guess we convinced her, looking at the fault and so on. Thus, it is only recently that the presence of an earthquake at Mycenae has begun to be a serious hypothesis. The evidence can be summarized under 3 headings: the nature of the destruction, methods of construction and repair, and the cognitive implications. And I don't know what she means by that, but anyway. She got transformed. And as I told you earlier, this stuff has irritated a lot. Well, archaeologists who excavate find this idea that earthquake could have played a role in all these ruins that they find quite useful. It's not all ruins are by earthquakes, but it allows them to begin to interpret stuff that they couldn't interpret for decades with a different facet. The people who don't like it are the so-called theoretical archaeologists, because going back to the first slide I showed you, like historians, this is kind of a stupid agent. An earthquake comes in, it's not related to what we have done or what we do. We're not responsible for it. It's an arbitrary agent. What did he say? I really like the wording here. The vain repetitions of senseless laws of nature. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amos. We have questions. First, I'm going to ask one. Amos, I was wondering, particularly with respect to the Aegean city-states and the Eastern Mediterranean, whether there might be any evidence of tsunami or other possibly earthquake-generated.
Yeah, in fact, one of the interesting things, when I gave this talk to American Archaeological Society, several archaeologists who were excavating there came up and we got talking about evidence for both tsunamis and liquefaction. Especially in coastal, not far from Ugarit, a French archaeologist, a woman, said, you know, we've been seeing this sand covering the site. It's liquefaction probably, and other places there's evidence in the Peloponnesos for tsunamis.
Before I pass that, is there any evidence in ancient, I guess, human history of any earthquake retrofitting?
Some people claim that they could see at later levels in Troy that they have done something to be better protected. And in Megiddo, a later wall, one of the late walls, is sort of, it's not a straight wall, but it has slots in it, which could be interpreted as such. But basically, as one of the quotes said, but they always felt, in general, they felt that the earthquake that hit them is unique in world history. It never happened before, never will happen again. And so the idea of repeat earthquakes and faults and so on, it wasn't there. So it was, yeah.
That was my first question. My second question is, it's an overall question. I've always felt that the Richter scale is non-intuitive, except that people are used to thinking logarithmically.
Right.
Has it ever been considered to have a more arithmetic scale, such that the difference between, arithmetic scale between 10 and 100 makes sense, but between 2 and 3 doesn't make much sense?
Right. Well, I think if you do that, then, well, it's if you do that, then most earthquakes are of no interest whatsoever. It's only the big ones. So you wouldn't pay attention. You know, right now there are magnitude 2 or 3 earthquakes happening all the time, not far from here on the San Andreas. We don't even feel them. You need very sensitive instruments that are buried deep down in the fault, but they occur all the time. So if we use a linear scale, all these things don't count at all. So I know it's not intuitive, and we have to remind people that going from magnitude 6 to 7, it's a factor of 30 or 32 in terms of energy release. Yeah.
How would you compare the effect of this earthquake storm on the late Bronze Age to the explosion of the Thera volcano, which is the theory I've heard about of geological nature most frequently?
Well, the Thera volcano explosion was a horrendous event in the Eastern Mediterranean. No question about it. You look at the caldera, you can figure out that, you know, the topography was about maybe 1,500 meters of the volcano before it exploded. It was a huge event. The thing is, it's geographically more restricted. It caused a big tidal wave, a tsunami, and it was felt in Egypt, in Alexandria. Alexandria was already in existence and so on. But with the earthquake, we have this huge storm that sweeps over a huge area. So, but certainly those volcanic explosions are another example for why Toynbee is, you know, has to be questioned on this issue. Yeah. And Krakatoa is another one, you know, and there are probably more in our history that we don't even know where the volcano was that blew up in Alaska or in Kamchatka. Yeah.
The big one in Indonesia that 70,000 years ago.
Right, right.
You indicated a 50-year interval for the events at the end of the Bronze Age, but how accurate are those dates? And is it possible it was one large earthquake sometime in that time frame?
This is what Jaffer has proposed, actually, one single large earthquake. And I would say from what we know, it's unlikely because it's huge. It would be a magnitude 10 or so, 9.5 or 10. But it's true that we don't know, there's no reason why a magnitude 10 earthquake cannot occur. It's just that we have not experienced it in the period of history or instrumentation for which we have data. So it's possible.
But it was a rare thing in some sense, so maybe that's it.
Could be, could be. I want to show you this slide. This is the great Assam earthquake in India. I think it's what was the year? 1880 or something like that. It was a huge earthquake, unbelievable. This is the intensity 6. This is the intensity 7, roughly, outline of this earthquake. And there's a possibility that it was actually much bigger, or maybe there were two events that were close to one another. But if you look at the scale here, this is something like, 700 miles across. So it's conceivable that super large earthquakes could happen, but we don't know. The archaeologists claim that they, from coins and shards and so on, they claim that there was a spread of something like 50 years. But it's a good question. How reliable is that?
There's an interesting parallel that has probably occurred to several people in this room between your work and the work that was done 30 years ago by Luis Alvarez and colleagues, showing that impacts were important in the history of life on the planet, and particularly the KT extinction 65 million years ago. What's kind of interesting as well is that we did too good a job in convincing people that impacts can play a role in the history of life on the planet, and people started believing that most extinctions in the fossil record were the result of impacts, and now opinion has swung in the other direction that the KT extinction may be the exception and the others had other causes. So there's just an interesting dynamic here that one could compare to your work and what's going on.
Yeah, well, I would add to it also, there's a philosophical issue about catastrophes or catastrophic events. And I have a quote here, let's see. I ran into real trouble with theoretical archaeologists. Godzilla is the earthquake or me, and Babylon is some site. Yeah, he's the editor of Archaeology. He published this article, and he got some cartoonists to make this drawing. And that's what he says about an article we published. All neocatastrophism is cut from the same cloth of doom would be incorrect. But some tries to be rigorous and serious, some is undoubtedly trendy, and some is a return to Velikovsky. He doesn't mention me by name, but this is written about my person. At best, it's an acknowledgement that catastrophes happen and that we shouldn't dismiss them out of hand as archaeological presentation. This is basically an attempt to place them within the uniformitarian system. So there's a hint here of neocatastrophist, catastrophist, creationist. Yeah. And it's coming from a theoretical archaeologist who really attacking an earth scientist. I mean, at least we like to think that we do science, and so that's where the Godzilla comes in. Yet even the better work by neocatastrophists tends to be strong on the catastrophe side and weak on the aftershocks. Yeah, okay.
The layers of, the multiple layers of Troy, I believe you said 40-something.
Yeah.
The one that corresponds the period of the Trojan War, where does that lie?
I think it's layer, well, the 40 are all kinds of layers, but out of the major ones, it's kind of roughly in the middle. Yeah.
And what is the range? From the oldest to
the oldest, I think Troy was founded something like 5000 BC, and left history maybe in the middle of the first millennium, in part because the sedimentation was such that it wasn't a port anymore. It became too far away from Dardanelles, and so it lost its importance.
Okay, well, Amos, I think we keep you here off noon, but
all right, thank you, guys.
We'll end here.